they start killing people like they have in the past, I think they're going to get hit very hard by the internet.
What is happening in Iran has just entered a new phase. The internet is gone. No social media, no messaging apps, no live footage. But this does not mean silence. Because when governments cut the internet, people do not stop organizing. They adapt. And what replaces the internet is often far more dangerous for those in power. What happens when a country suddenly goes dark? In Iran, the blackout is not a metaphor. The internet is cut. Social platforms disappear. Messaging apps go silent. Live footage vanishes overnight. To the outside world, it looks like control. But inside the country, it signals something else entirely. Because internet shutdowns are not used when a government feels strong. They are used when it feels exposed. The decision to pull the plug is never taken lightly. It comes at a cost: economic loss, international scrutiny, internal frustration. When authorities accept that cost, it usually means they believe information is more dangerous than outrage. And that tells us a lot about the moment Iran is in. At first glance, cutting the internet seems like the ultimate move. No coordination, no viral videos, no external attention. A protest without visibility is easier to contain. That is the theory. The reality is far messier. Iran has lived through shutdowns before. People remember. They adapt quickly. When the digital layer disappears, older systems wake up. Systems that do not rely on servers, platforms, or algorithms. Communication does not stop. It mutates. When mobile data collapses, voice calls and basic SMS often become the first fallback. Short messages replace long conversations. Information is compressed. Locations, times, simple instructions. The goal is not to persuade online audiences anymore. It is to move people in the physical world. At the same time, word-of-mouth networks reactivate. Mosques, marketplaces, workplaces, universities. Places where people already gather become nodes again. One person hears something, tells 5 others. Those 5 tell 20. The speed is slower than social media, but the trust is higher. And trust matters more than speed in moments like this. Another layer quietly comes into play: proximity-based communication. Phones talk to each other without the internet. Bluetooth, offline messaging apps, short-range transfers. Messages hop from device to device as people move through the city. A human mesh network forms, invisible to anyone monitoring data centers. It is imperfect, it is fragmented, but it works well enough to coordinate presence, not ideology. And this is the key difference. Online movements are about visibility. Offline movements are about pressure. When people cannot post, they show up. When they cannot broadcast, they gather. For authorities, this creates a paradox. The blackout reduces international optics, but it concentrates unrest locally. Streets become louder precisely because the digital outlet is gone. Anger has nowhere else to go. This is why internet shutdowns often mark an escalation, not a de-escalation. They indicate that the struggle has moved from screens to streets. And once that shift happens, the state is no longer fighting hashtags. It is dealing with bodies, logistics, and loyalty. What matters next is not who controls the narrative online, but who controls movement offline. And that is where things become unpredictable. When the internet disappears, organization does not vanish. It decentralizes. In Iran, this matters more than most places. Years of sanctions, surveillance, and periodic crackdowns have already trained society to function with gaps. The blackout does not introduce chaos. It removes convenience. And convenience was never the backbone of resistance. Without centralized platforms, coordination becomes cellular. Small groups act semi-independently, guided by shared expectations rather than live instructions. Meeting points are agreed on in advance. Times are approximate. Redundancy replaces precision. This makes movements harder to map. Security services rely on interception, pattern analysis, and real-time monitoring. Internet shutdowns cut them off from foreign eyes, but they also blind their own systems. When digital trails disappear, prediction becomes guesswork. This is why shutdowns often come with something else: increased physical presence. More checkpoints, more patrols, more pressure on known gathering places. The state compensates for lost visibility with bodies on the ground. But that creates another problem. Every officer deployed is an officer exposed. Every checkpoint becomes a point of friction. Every order requires compliance, not just transmission. And compliance depends on morale. When communication is fragmented, rumors spread faster than facts. Is the blackout temporary or permanent? Are other cities moving? Are security units still unified? Is leadership confident or buying time? In information vacuums, uncertainty multiplies. Some people assume the worst and stay home. Others assume the moment is critical and move immediately. This divergence creates unpredictability, which is dangerous for centralized control. Meanwhile, alternative channels quietly activate. Satellite dishes are adjusted. Foreign SIM cards circulate. Smuggled devices become shared resources. A single working connection can function as a relay, passing updates verbally from neighborhood to neighborhood. This is slow, risky, and inefficient, but it is enough, because mass movements do not require constant updates. They require alignment, a shared sense that something is happening now, and that waiting carries its own cost. Cutting the internet also changes who leads. Online, influence belongs to those who can speak the loudest. Offline, influence belongs to those who can move people physically. Local figures matter again. Shop owners, union organizers, religious figures, university staff, people who know spaces, schedules, and escape routes. Leadership becomes situational, not performative. For the state, this is uncomfortable. It is much easier to silence accounts than to disperse crowds. It is much easier to block platforms than to restore fear once it fades. And fear fades quickly when people realize they are not alone. This is the hidden risk of shutdowns. They remove the illusion of isolation. Without screens, individuals measure pressure by what they see around them, not by what they scroll past. A closed shop, a crowded street, a delayed bus, a whispered warning. These signals carry more weight than trending topics ever did. At this stage, control depends less on technology and more on loyalty. Orders must be followed in person. Lines must hold. Units must trust that they are not being abandoned. And when that trust weakens, even temporarily, space opens. Space for movement. Space for defiance. Space for mistakes. Internet shutdowns are designed to freeze a moment. In reality, they often accelerate it. Because once communication moves offline, it stops being visible, and what is invisible is harder to stop. When a state cuts the internet, it is making a bet that fear will outpace coordination, a bet that isolation will break momentum, a bet that silence equals control. History shows that this bet often fails, because shutdowns do not eliminate dissent. They compress it. Pressure that would normally dissipate online is forced back into physical space. Streets replace timelines. Faces replace profiles. Risk becomes shared, and shared risk changes behavior. At this stage, the most important question is no longer how people communicate. It is who still believes the system will hold. Internet blackouts expose a fragile truth. Modern states rely on digital order not just to govern populations, but to reassure their own institutions. When that layer is removed, uncertainty spreads upward as much as downward. Command chains strain. Local officials wait for guidance that does not arrive. Security forces act cautiously, unsure whether escalation will be supported or disowned. In these moments, power becomes local. A city that moves while another stays quiet creates imbalance. A unit that hesitates while another advances creates doubt. A rumor about leadership weakness travels faster than any verified statement ever could. This is why shutdowns often coincide with something else. Visible hesitation at the top. The blackout is not meant to last forever. It is a pause, a window, a chance to regain footing. But every pause carries a risk. The longer the silence stretches, the more people interpret it as loss of control rather than restraint. And once that interpretation takes hold, it is difficult to reverse. For those watching from outside, the absence of footage can be misleading. A quiet internet does not mean a quiet country. It often means the opposite. It means activity has moved beyond the lens. This matters not just for Iran, but for the region around it. When internal pressure builds without release, outcomes tend to be abrupt. Movements do not fade gradually, they jump stages. What looks frozen one day can shift dramatically the next, and when that shift happens, consequences travel. Borders feel it. Neighbors adjust. Europe pays attention, because large-scale movement rarely begins with open collapse. It begins with moments like this, when normal channels are cut and societies are forced to operate without them. The internet blackout is not the end of the story. It is a signal that the struggle has moved beyond narrative control, a signal that what comes next will be decided on the ground, not online. So the real question is not whether Iran can restore its connections. The question is whether, after this pause, the system can restore confidence. Because once people learn to organize without the internet, they do not simply forget how. And once fear is broken offline, it is far harder to rebuild, no matter how many cables are switched back on.